We were both 21, on the edge of graduation, and we thought we had everything figured out until one quiet night changed everything. We didn't plan it. We didn't even talk about it. But what happened that night, we couldn't ignore. The night started like so many others before it, unremarkable in its appearance, forgettable in its first few minutes. It was the kind of evening that passed without notice. Low music playing from someone's half-broken speaker, mismatched drinks on the kitchen counter, and clusters of college seniors floating between rooms, too tired to party, but too restless to stay home. Eli Rhodes hadn't planned to stay long. He rarely did. Social gatherings drained him more than they energized, and parties, especially this late into the semester, felt like going through the motions. But Merrick Calloway was there. That changed things. They had known each other since freshman orientation. Their majors were different, their circles adjacent, but not overlapping. Still, Eli had always noticed him. Merrick was the kind of person who filled space effortlessly, warm in the way he smiled at people, loud when he didn't have to be, always with a joke that wasn't as careless as it seemed. Eli had watched him from a distance, not with envy, but with curiosity. Over time, their casual interactions became routine, familiar nods in hallways, shared smirks during boring lectures, and eventually moments that felt almost intentional. That night, the house had thinned out quicker than usual. Rain started falling around midnight, turning the warm, spring air heavy and still. People left in small groups. Some stayed the night in guest rooms or on couches. Eli had been planning to walk home, but the weather had other plans. Merrick found him in the hallway, scrolling through his phone, deciding whether the storm was worth it. Merrick didn't ask. He just gestured toward the guest room. Eli followed. The guest room was smaller than he remembered. A narrow bed, old posters curling off the walls, and a faint scent of dust in the air. Merrick dropped his bag on the floor and flopped onto the bed like he owned it. Eli stood in the doorway longer than necessary before stepping inside. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was thick, though charged with something unsaid. They didn't talk much at first. Just lay there, side by side, both fully clothed, their legs hanging slightly off the edge of the mattress. Outside, the rain tapped steadily against the windows. Inside, time slowed. Eli could feel Merrick's presence like a magnetic pull. Not loud or obvious, but constant. The way his breath rose and fell, the way his hand rested near his own, barely brushing against the blanket between them. They weren't touching, but it felt like they were on the edge of something. And maybe they had been for a long time. They talked a little in the way people do when they're not ready to say what really matters. About classes, professors they'd never liked, future plans that felt too big and too far away to mean anything yet. But beneath the surface of each word was a different conversation, one that had never been spoken out loud. Eli wasn't sure when it happened, exactly. Maybe it was the way Merrick turned his head slightly when he laughed, or the way his voice grew quieter the longer they talked. Maybe it was how, for the first time, he wasn't joking. There was no performance, no mask. Just Merrick, real, close, and quiet. The room seemed smaller by the minute. At one point, Merrick shifted on the mattress, his arm accidentally brushing against Eli's. Neither of them moved away. The silence after was heavier, but not uncomfortable. It settled over them like a blanket, warm, strange, undeniable. Eli stared at the ceiling, listening to the storm, his heart drumming louder than the rain. Something was different. Not just tonight, but for a while now. He had felt it, those fleeting moments that stuck in his chest long after Merrick had walked away. The way their eyes held too long. The quiet moments that didn't feel like silence at all. And now they were here, lying side by side, not speaking but saying everything. Eli thought about leaving, not because he wanted to, but because staying meant acknowledging something he wasn't sure he was ready to admit. But his body didn't move. He couldn't look at Merrick, couldn't speak, but he also couldn't walk away. Because deep down, he didn't want to. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't a phase or a mistake or some fluke of proximity. It was something else, something older, something that had been growing between them since the beginning, invisible but alive. And in that quiet room, with the storm outside and the steady rhythm of Marek's breathing beside him, Eli realized he didn't feel afraid. Not anymore. What he felt was something else entirely. And that was the beginning. The room hadn't changed, but the air inside it had. Eli felt it settle around them. Not heavy, but undeniable, like static just before a summer storm. Merrick hadn't said much in the last few minutes. Neither had he. Words felt like they'd get in the way, like they'd drag whatever this was into something too real, too exposed. So they just lay there, still on the narrow bed, side by side, the hum of rain outside filling the silence. Merrick shifted, not dramatically, just enough for his shoulder to brush lightly against Eli's. Eli didn't move away. It was barely a touch, but it sent a ripple through him, like his body was more aware of Marek's nearness than his mind could process. For a second, Eli thought it was accidental, until Merrick moved again. Slower this time, more deliberate. Still no words. They'd grown up around a culture that taught them how to laugh things off, how to bury anything too vulnerable under sarcasm or silence. This wasn't how guys acted. This wasn't how friends acted. But in that moment, they weren't just two guys lying on a bed anymore. They weren't just friends. They were something else entirely. Marek's hand rested between them, fingers barely curled. Eli's own hand was close, too close to pretend the distance didn't matter. For a while, he stared at it, trying to decide what it would mean to reach out, to close that gap, to let himself want something he hadn't let himself name. The bed creaked slightly as Merrick adjusted again, this time turning more toward Eli, his breath brushing across the fabric of Eli's sleeve. The movement wasn't loud or intentional. It just was natural, like maybe they'd been heading toward this moment for longer than either of them realized. Eli finally turned his head just slightly. Marek's eyes were already on him. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence was full of questions, full of answers too, but neither of them moved to break it. Not yet. There was something sacred about this quiet, something unspoken that hung between them with the weight of years of almosts. And then Marek's fingers moved. Not much, just a soft shift, brushing against Eli's hand. The contact was fleeting, barely there, but it was enough. Eli's heart jumped. Still, he didn't pull away. The air between them felt warmer now, tighter, more fragile. Another brush, this time slower. A pause. Then Marek's hand found his under the thin blanket, fingers tentative, trembling just slightly. Eli let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The warmth of Marek's palm against his own was steadying, anchoring. It didn't feel wrong. It didn't feel confusing. It felt real, felt safe. Marek's fingers tightened slightly around his. Not a question, not a demand, just presence. Still no words. Eli turned toward him fully now, not letting go of his hand. The room was still dark, shadows stretching across the walls in soft, irregular shapes. The storm outside had quieted, but inside everything was louder now. His heartbeat, his thoughts, the closeness they were finally allowing to exist. He could see Marek's face in the dim light. Not entirely, but enough. The set of his mouth, the way his brow tensed just slightly like he was bracing for rejection or regret, or both. But there was no regret in Eli's chest. Just a quiet, growing clarity. This had always been there. The distance between them hadn't been about space. It had been about fear. Fear of what it meant to want. Fear of what it meant to be seen. Fear of the moment after this one. But now, hand in hand, breath steadying, silence stretching, there was no fear. Eli shifted closer, just enough to feel Marek's arm against his. The contact was warm, grounding. He didn't know where this would go, didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was this. They weren't pretending anymore. Not tonight. Morning light crept in slowly, slipping through the half-closed blinds and stretching across the quiet room, like a gentle reminder that the world hadn't stopped. Eli blinked into the soft, gray glow, his thoughts stirring before his body moved. The familiar space of the guest room looked no different than the night before, but everything within it had changed. Merrick was still next to him. His breathing was soft, steady. One arm rested loosely across Eli's waist, his body half turned toward him. The blanket had shifted during the night, leaving bare patches of skin between shirts and sleeves. It wasn't intimate in the way others might assume. It wasn't messy or chaotic, but there was something unmistakably close about the way they lay. Like gravity had decided they belonged in this shape. Eli didn't move. Not yet. Instead, he let himself take in the details, the quiet rhythm of Marek's breath, the way the light brushed against his cheek, how peaceful he looked when he wasn't trying to be anything for anyone. It was the kind of moment that didn't demand anything. It just existed. But with it came the inevitable question, what now? They were still them. Still students on the cusp of graduation, still caught somewhere between adolescence and adulthood, still figuring out who they were. Last night hadn't rewritten their lives, but it had shifted something beneath the surface, subtle, powerful, irreversible. And now the morning had arrived, asking them to face it. Eli's thoughts swirled in quiet loops. There was no regret. That surprised him. He had expected to wake up with a knot in his chest, maybe even panic. But what he felt was something quieter. A little nervous, yes, but not afraid. Just uncertain. Because this wasn't a mistake. And that made it more complicated. Marek stirred beside him, his breathing hitching slightly as he shifted under the covers. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first. Then they landed on Eli, and the faintest smile appeared, tired but warm. Not a word was spoken. Not right away. There was no panic in Marek's expression either. No awkward pull back or scramble to pretend nothing had happened. Just quiet awareness. A shared understanding that the boundary between them wasn't where it had been the day before. They stayed like that for a while, awake still, not rushing anything. Eli didn't feel the need to fill the silence. He could tell Marek was thinking too. Processing, not avoiding, just sitting in the moment with him. Eventually, Marek's hand moved, brushing against Eli's with the lightest touch. Not grabbing, not clinging, just grounding. It was the kind of gesture that didn't ask for reassurance. It gave it. Eli turned his head slightly, meeting Marek's gaze. There was vulnerability there, yes, but not shame. Not uncertainty, just openness. A silent offering, I don't regret this. Do you? Eli's answer was quiet and wordless, just a small, tired nod. The kind that said everything. They didn't talk about what it meant. Not yet. The moment didn't ask for definitions. It asked for presence, for honesty, for something real. Eventually, they got up. The day called to them. Responsibilities, routines, the illusion of normalcy waiting just outside the bedroom door. They moved quietly through the house, gathering their things, brushing teeth, pulling on jackets. Nothing extravagant, nothing out of the ordinary to anyone watching. But for them, everything had changed. The car ride back to campus was filled with silence. Not heavy, not strained, just thoughtful. Eli watched the passing trees blur outside the window, thinking about how strange it was that life could feel exactly the same when something so important had just shifted. People passed him on sidewalks. Cars honked in the distance. The world kept spinning. Marek dropped him off at his dorm. They exchanged a glance before parting, brief but steady. There was no forced goodbye, no dramatic farewell. Just a look that said, this isn't over. Whatever this is, it matters. And that was enough. Eli climbed the stairs to his room slowly, the events of the night tucked somewhere inside his chest like a fragile new truth. It hadn't been loud or wild. There were no grand declarations or reckless confessions. Just two people lying side by side, choosing not to lie to themselves anymore. He didn't have a plan for what would come next, but he didn't feel alone in it either. The days that followed passed without incident, at least from the outside. Eli still went to class. Marek still showed up late with that same half grin. They sat in different rows during lectures, passed each other on the quad, waved across crowded spaces. No one watching would have noticed anything out of the ordinary. But for them, everything had changed. It was subtle, so subtle that even they weren't sure what to make of it. There were no grand gestures, no obvious signs. Just a growing quiet between them, a silence that wasn't avoidance but acknowledgement. Something had shifted, and it lived between them now in every glance, every pause, every small hesitation. At night, it was different. They didn't see each other every evening, but when they did, it felt like slipping into a space where everything made sense. They didn't talk about that night in the guest room. They didn't pick it apart, didn't try to name what they were or what it meant. Instead, they talked about everything else: childhood memories, dreams they'd never voiced aloud, music that made them feel things they couldn't explain. Sometimes they just sat in silence. And somehow, that silence felt more honest than any words. One night, a week after everything had changed, they ended up back at Marek's apartment. It wasn't planned. Eli had walked with him after class, and they kept walking, talking about nothing in particular, until they reached the familiar front door. Marek had opened it without a word, and Eli had stepped inside like he belonged there. The space was small, sparsely decorated, but warm. It smelled faintly of old coffee and Marek's cologne. Eli took a seat on the floor, leaning back against the couch. Marek sat beside him, close enough that their arms brushed every now and then. They talked for a while, but eventually the conversation faded, replaced by a calm that neither of them wanted to disturb. The quiet felt different in the dark, softer, more fragile. Eli thought about how easy it would be to ruin it, to say too much, to reach for more than they were ready for. So he didn't. He stayed still, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the next room and the faint sound of wind outside the window. Marek broke the silence first. Not with a question, not with a confession, just a sentence. "I've been thinking about that night." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heavy. Just true. Eli didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. His heartbeat did enough talking. Marek continued, voice quieter now. "I haven't stopped thinking about it. Still no question. Still no demand. Just a truth laid bare between them." Eli turned slightly, enough to see the edge of Marek's expression in the dim light. There was no tension there, no fear, just honesty, openness, and something else, hope maybe. They didn't move closer that night, didn't reach for each other the way they had before. But something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, a shared acceptance. This wasn't going away, and neither of them wanted it to. The next morning, life returned like it always did. Papers due, group projects, the dull buzz of campus life. Eli walked through it all with a strange kind of focus, his thoughts never drifting far from Marek. The memory of his voice, quiet and certain, stayed with him, like a whisper at the edge of everything. What they had wasn't defined. It wasn't loud, but it was real, and real things take time. The world around them didn't pause. No one asked questions. No one noticed that they lingered just a bit longer after class, or that their messages to each other grew longer, more thoughtful, less guarded. At night, they kept meeting, not always physically, but through their words, texts, late-night calls, even shared playlists. Little offerings, subtle ways of saying, "I see you. I'm still here." It became a rhythm, a quiet connection that made the noise of the world feel manageable. They didn't talk about labels. They didn't need to. The truth was in the way they looked at each other now, in the comfort they found in shared silence, in the way their conversations had stopped circling and started landing. They were figuring it out, together. Time moved differently after that night. Not slower, not faster, just more deliberately. Eli found himself noticing things he'd once let blur past. The way Marek leaned back in his chair during lectures, the quiet way he tapped his pencil when thinking, how his voice softened just slightly when he said Eli's name. These were small things, but they stayed with him. They meant something now. Their connection had found its rhythm. Not rushed, not defined, but undeniably real. It lived in subtle gestures. A glance held a little longer than before, the way their shoulders would brush and neither would move away. No one around them asked questions, and maybe that was part of the safety they'd built. It was theirs, private, still unfolding. One late afternoon, just as the sky began to shift from gold to gray, Eli found Marek sitting alone in the student cafe, a half-empty coffee beside him and a far-off look in his eyes. It wasn't unusual, but something about the moment felt different, quieter, as though a decision was waiting to be made. Eli sat down without speaking, their usual quiet settling between them. Marek turned his head slightly, acknowledging him with a faint smile. But this time there was something behind it, a hesitation, a question. Eli could feel it too. He didn't speak. Instead, he let the silence stretch until it folded into something comfortable, something intentional. Merrick finally broke it, not with a dramatic declaration, but with a simple, steady truth. "I don't want to keep pretending," he said, his voice low, calm. There was no panic in his words, no pressure, just clarity. Eli took a breath, letting the weight of those words settle inside him. He understood exactly what Merrick meant. Not about pretending in public, but pretending that what they shared didn't matter. That was some fragile thing they had to tiptoe around. He nodded. It was time. That night, they met at Marek's apartment. No ikachin. No reason. Just presence. It wasn't dramatic or romantic in any traditional sense. No candles, no music, no big speeches. Just two people who had stopped hiding from each other. They sat on the couch, close enough for comfort, far enough for breath. And in the soft light of the living room, Merrick turned to face him. "I don't know what this is going to be," he said carefully, "but I want it to be something." Eli's chest tightened, not from fear, but from the overwhelming simplicity of the moment. This wasn't about certainty. It was about choice. The choice to begin. He didn't respond with words. Instead, he reached out, letting his hand rest lightly over Marek's. The contact was small, but the meaning was everything. They weren't just sharing quiet anymore. They were stepping into something together. What followed wasn't loud. It wasn't marked by fireworks or declarations. It was quiet, intentional, full of glances and breath and a deep, mutual understanding that they didn't have to know everything to move forward. They lay side by side for a long time, not talking, just existing in the same space, the same breath. Occasionally, their hands would find each other. Occasionally, their eyes would meet. But mostly, they just let the silence speak. There was peace in that. In the days that followed, not much changed on the surface. They still went to class, still hung out with the same people, still navigated the daily routines of being college seniors. But under the surface, everything was different. They didn't define it. They didn't have to. What they had was slow, deliberate, and deeply felt. They began to make space for each other, not just in their schedules, but in their lives. A seat saved in lecture halls. A message after a long day. A glance across a crowded room that said, "I'm thinking of you." And in those small moments, the quiet built something solid between them. They never made a public announcement. No one demanded one. Their world didn't require permission. It only required honesty, and they'd finally found it. Weeks later, while walking home after a late evening on campus, Merrick glanced over and asked softly, "Do you ever think about how all this started?" Eli smiled. All the time. It wasn't a question of regret. It wasn't nostalgia. It was recognition that something good had begun in silence, in uncertainty, and had grown into something strong without ever needing to be forced. They didn't know what the future would bring. Graduation was coming. Life would change. But what mattered was this. They had chosen to begin, not because they were sure of where it would go, but because they were sure of each other. And that, more than anything, was enough.